My brother stole my identity to buy a house. Then he tried to evict me from it. He did not anticipate what came next. I need you to understand something about my brother Calvin before I tell you what he did, because the most dangerous people in your life are rarely the ones who look dangerous. They're the ones who look like the fun one, the charismatic one, the one everybody in the family secretly likes best at holidays because they tell the best stories and always know when to top off your drink and have this particular gift for making you feel, when you're talking to them, like you are the most interesting person in the room. Calvin is 4 years older than me. He is, by almost every social metric, impressive. 6 feet tall, easy laugh, the kind of handsome that reads as trustworthy rather than threatening, which is its own particular danger. He had a wide orbit of friends, always knew somebody who knew somebody, always had a plan that was just about to come together. Growing up, I worshipped him in the uncomplicated way that younger siblings worship older ones when the older one hasn't yet shown you who they actually are. I thought he was what success looked like. I thought being like Calvin was the goal. It took me until I was 31 years old, sitting in a lawyer's office staring at a document I had not signed, to understand exactly who Calvin was. And then it took me another 18 months to make sure everyone else understood it too. I should tell you about how I ended up living in that house because the circumstances matter and because I've seen some versions of this story online where people skip the setup and the whole thing loses its shape. Our grandmother, our mother's mother, Nana Ruth, died when I was 28. She left behind a house in a neighborhood that had been working class when she bought it 40 years ago and had since gentrified considerably. The house itself was modest, a 3-bedroom craftsman that she had kept up faithfully for decades, with a particular garden in the backyard that she had tended like a second child. She left the house to both Calvin and me jointly 50-50, with a note in the will that said she hoped we would figure out together what to do with it and that she trusted us to be fair to each other. I want to pause here and just say that I think about that note a lot now. I think about Nana Ruth writing it, probably at her kitchen table, probably with the confidence of a woman who had watched her grandsons grow up and believed, in the way grandmothers sometimes stubbornly believe, that the people she loved were fundamentally good. I think about what she would have made of what came next. I try not to be angry at her for trusting him. She had no way to know. In the months after she died, Calvin and I talked about the house. He had a real estate contact, he said, a guy from his network who worked in property development, and he wanted to explore whether we could do something more with it than just sell it outright. Maybe renovate and rent it, maybe hold it for appreciation, maybe something else. He said he wanted to handle the research side of things since he had the connections, and I said that sounded fine. I was deep in a demanding stretch at work at the time. I'm a civil engineer and we were in the middle of a multi-year infrastructure project that was eating every available hour, and the idea of someone else handling the legwork was genuinely appealing. In the meantime, I was also in a complicated living situation. I had been renting an apartment that my landlord had just decided to sell, meaning I had about 60 days to find somewhere new. Calvin suggested, casually, that I move into Nana Ruth's house while we sorted out the longer-term plan. He'd handle the paperwork to formalize the arrangement, he said. It made sense financially and logistically, and I trusted him, and so I said yes. I moved my things into the house in November, 2 months after Nana Ruth's funeral, and I slept in the small back bedroom that still smelled faintly of her lavender sachets and told myself it was a temporary situation that would sort itself out in a few months. I lived there for almost 2 years before I found out what had been happening the whole time I was sleeping in that back bedroom. The first crack appeared on a Tuesday morning in February when I got a credit alert on my phone. I have a credit monitoring service. I signed up for it years ago after a coworker had their identity stolen and I got spooked enough to take precautions. The alerts come through as push notifications and they're usually things like a new account inquiry, something routine, something I can identify immediately and dismiss. This one was not routine. This one was a notification that a mortgage had been opened in my name for a property amount that was significantly larger than anything I owned, associated with an address I knew immediately, Nana Ruth's house. I stood in my kitchen, in Nana Ruth's kitchen, holding my phone and reading the notification 3 times. I want to tell you I understood immediately what had happened. I didn't. The mind resists the most disorienting conclusions. What I understood in that moment was that something was badly wrong, but the full shape of it, the complete picture of what my brother had done, took several days and a great deal of documentation to fully assemble. Here is what I found out. Approximately 14 months earlier, while I was living in the house under the informal arrangement Calvin had suggested, Calvin had used my personal information, my social security number, my date of birth, my name, a copy of a document I'd signed years earlier for an unrelated family matter that he'd evidently retained and repurposed, to apply for a mortgage on the house. The mortgage had been taken out in my name. Not his name. Mine. He had leveraged my credit score, which was considerably better than his because I was careful with money and he was not, to secure financing he would not have qualified for on his own. The property had then been titled in a way that, on the surface, appeared to reflect a legitimate transaction. He had, somewhere in the paper architecture he'd constructed, also used a quitclaim deed to transfer my interest in the property, signed with what purported to be my signature, to himself. The house that had belonged to Nana Ruth, that she had left to both of us equally, that I was living in under a verbal arrangement with my brother, was now mortgaged against my credit and legally titled to him. And I had not signed a single document in the process. A mortgage in my name that I had not taken out. A deed transfer with my name on it that I had not signed. And me, sleeping in the back bedroom, paying Calvin a monthly contribution toward expenses that he had suggested and I had agreed to like the trusting fool I was, which I now understood was him collecting rent on a property he had stolen using my identity to purchase. I sat down on the kitchen floor when the full picture assembled itself. I'm not being dramatic. I literally sat down on the floor because my legs didn't feel particularly reliable at that moment. I sat on Nana Ruth's kitchen floor and looked at the cabinets she'd painted yellow in 1987 and didn't move for a while. Then I got up, and I made a list. The first call I made was to an attorney. Not a family friend, not someone I knew socially, not anyone with any possible connection to Calvin. I searched for attorneys who specialized specifically in identity theft and real estate fraud, which is a narrower practice area than you might think, and I found 3 cities over who had relevant case history. I called on a Wednesday morning and got an appointment for Friday. The second call I made was to the credit bureau to place a fraud alert and begin the dispute process on the mortgage. The third call I made was to a friend of mine named Paulette who works in financial forensics and who I knew would understand both the technical and legal dimensions of what I was describing. She listened to the whole thing in one sitting, asked about 6 clarifying questions, and then said with the particular quietness of someone deciding something, "You need to document everything you have access to right now before he knows you know." I said I understood. She said, "I mean today. I mean right now after we hang up." I said I understood that too. I spent the next 4 hours photographing and scanning every document in the house that might be relevant. Nana Ruth's original will. Every piece of mail that had come to the house in my name versus his name. The payment records from the money I'd been sending Calvin monthly. The text messages between Calvin and me about the living arrangement and the plan for the house going back 2 years. My original credit monitoring notification. Everything. The attorney, whose name was Harriet and who had the particular energy of someone who has seen human dishonesty in such volume that it no longer surprises her but still genuinely offends her, reviewed my documentation at our Friday meeting with a focused attention that I found immediately reassuring. She asked me a series of very precise questions. She took notes. She did not say anything speculative or emotional. At the end of the meeting she said, "This is a serious case. There are multiple criminal statutes potentially involved and significant civil remedies available to you. I need you to not contact your brother about any of this until we have a strategy. Can you do that?" I said yes. She said, "I mean genuinely. Not a text. Not a hint. Nothing." I said I understood. She said she'd be in touch within the week. I drove home to Nana Ruth's house and made dinner and didn't say anything to anyone. Living in the house for the 6 weeks that followed while the legal groundwork was being laid was one of the stranger experiences of my life. Calvin came by twice during that period. He still had a key, which I had not yet changed because Harriet had advised me to make no changes to my behavior that might alert him. And both times I watched him walk around the house with the relaxed proprietary ease of someone who considers himself the owner, and I kept my face entirely neutral and talked about ordinary things and let him leave without knowing anything had changed. I want to be honest. This was very hard. Not because I couldn't control my face. I've had a lot of practice keeping my face neutral around Calvin, it turns out. But because every time I looked at him during those visits I was processing the full reality of what he had done and finding new dimensions of it. He hadn't just committed fraud. He had done it while accepting my grief over our grandmother. He had done it while I was sleeping in her house, in her sheets, in the room that still had her lavender smell, thinking I was honoring her memory by being there. He had done it while I trusted him. And he had done it, I believe, without a single sustained moment of guilt, because Calvin is someone who has always had a very flexible relationship with the line between what is his and what he wants. Harriet's strategy as it unfolded was methodical and, I came to appreciate, exactly right. We filed a report with the police for identity theft and forgery, which created a criminal record of the allegation. We filed formal disputes with all 3 credit bureaus to begin the process of removing the fraudulent mortgage from my credit history. We initiated a civil suit against Calvin for fraud, identity theft, forgery of my signature, and unjust enrichment, the last charge reflecting the rent he had been collecting from me on property that should have been half mine and had been stolen using my identity. We contacted the mortgage lender with documentation of the fraud, which began their own internal investigation. And we prepared, as a strategic measure, the paper equivalent of an anvil, a motion to quiet title on the property that, if successful, would formally establish the fraudulent nature of the deed transfer and potentially unwind the whole arrangement. Harriet also contacted the probate court regarding Nana Ruth's estate, because the quitclaim deed that Calvin had apparently used to consolidate his ownership potentially constituted fraud on the estate as well, which opened up a separate set of legal consequences. It was a lot of moving pieces. I kept a binder. I updated it every few days. I found, in the keeping of the binder, something that felt like the only form of control available to me in a situation that was otherwise completely outside my control, and I held on to it accordingly. Calvin found out that I knew on a Thursday in April, 6 weeks after my initial discovery, when he was formally served with the civil suit at his apartment. He called me 40 minutes after being served. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. I let that one go too. The third time, Harriet had advised me I could answer, but to say only that I had retained legal counsel and that all communication should go through her. I answered on the third call and said exactly that. There was a silence on his end that lasted several seconds. Then he said, in a voice I'd never heard him use, stripped of the ease, stripped of the warmth, something flatter and more real underneath. How long have you known? I said, talk to my attorney. And I hung up. What happened next is where I wish I could tell you Calvin came to his senses. That the weight of what he'd done landed on him and something human in him responded to it. But what Calvin did instead was lawyer up and fight. He retained an attorney, a cousin of someone from his network, which tells you something, and that attorney sent back a response arguing that the transactions had been legitimate, that I had been informed and consenting, that the paperwork reflected actual agreements we had reached, and that my allegations were a bad faith attempt to relitigate settled estate decisions. And then, as if to demonstrate a confidence in this position that I can only describe as breathtaking in its miscalculation, Calvin sent me, through his attorney, a formal notice to vacate the property. He tried to evict me from Nana Ruth's house, using the fraudulent deed he had obtained by stealing my identity. I want to pause here for a moment and just let you sit with that, because I think the audacity of it requires a moment of silent acknowledgement before we continue. Harriet, when I forwarded her the notice, was quiet for a moment and then said, with what I had come to recognize as her version of dark satisfaction, "Good. This is actually good for us." She explained that by initiating eviction proceedings, Calvin had now formally asserted legal ownership of the property in a court-adjacent context, which meant his fraudulent claim was now on the record in a new venue and subject to challenge in a new arena. Every aggressive move he made was another thread for us to pull. The eviction hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. We had no intention of losing it. In the weeks between the notice and the hearing, several things happened simultaneously that I want to describe because they matter to how this resolved. First, the mortgage lender completed their investigation and concluded that the mortgage application had contained fraudulent representations. They referred the matter to their legal department and sent a notice to the relevant authorities. This was significant because it meant there was now a financial institution with its own attorneys and its own institutional interest in Calvin being held accountable. And financial institution attorneys are a different caliber of problem than a cousin of a friend from your network. Second, the police investigation, which I had begun to worry was moving slowly, accelerated when the detective assigned to the case located a notary whose stamp appeared on 2 of the forged documents. The notary, when contacted, denied having notarized those documents and provided records showing she had not been working on the dates shown. Forged notarization is a serious additional charge in most states. The detective called me to update me, and I wrote the information in the binder and then sat with the binder in my lap for a long time thinking about Calvin as a child, thinking about the way he used to let me follow him around the neighborhood, thinking about how completely you can fail to know the person you grew up with. Third, and in some ways most importantly, our mother found out. I had not told her. I had not wanted to put her in the middle of something, and I had not wanted the information to reach Calvin through her before I was ready. But she found out the way things eventually find their way in families. Through a combination of a phone call she wasn't supposed to hear and a cousin who couldn't keep quiet, and she called me on a Sunday evening and she didn't ask if it was true. She just said, "Tell me what happened," in the voice she used when I was a child, and she already knew the answer and just needed me to say it out loud. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is unusual for her. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I need to call your Aunt Denise." Aunt Denise is Nana Ruth's eldest daughter, my mother's sister, the family historian and the family conscience, the woman who keeps the records of everything that matters and who carries the moral weight of the family with a steadiness that nothing seems to shake. The significance of my mother saying she needed to call Aunt Denise was that it meant this was no longer just my situation. It had become a family situation. And in our family, when Aunt Denise gets involved, things get documented and witnessed and remembered and addressed in a way that does not allow for anyone's convenient revision of events. The eviction hearing happened on a Wednesday morning in June. I wore a suit I'd bought for a job interview 3 years prior, and I carried the binder, and I sat next to Harriet at a table across from Calvin and his attorney, and I looked at my brother and he looked at me and then he looked away first. Harriet presented our case methodically and without theater. She submitted the fraud report, the forged notarizations, the credit bureau dispute documentation, the mortgage lender's findings, the original will, the text message records in which Calvin had explicitly framed the living arrangement as temporary and informal, directly contradicting any claim that I had knowingly entered into a different kind of agreement. The financial forensics report, prepared by Paulette, documenting the money I had paid Calvin as rent and the lack of any legitimate legal basis for that rental relationship. Calvin's attorney argued that the transactions were legitimate and that I was a disgruntled co-heir trying to undo a fair arrangement through false allegations. I will give him this, a confident speaker. The judge listened to both sides with an expression that gave nothing away. At the end of the hearing, the judge denied the eviction on the grounds that the ownership of the property was actively disputed in pending litigation, and that evicting an occupant under a disputed title would be inappropriate pending resolution of the underlying claims. She also noted, in language that was careful and precise and which Harriet told me afterward was significant, that the documentation submitted raised serious questions about the validity of the deed transfer that the court would need to see fully addressed. Calvin's attorney tried to say something further, and the judge said she'd heard enough for today, and we were adjourned. I walked out of the courthouse into the June sun and stood on the steps for a moment. Harriet came out beside me and said, "That went well," which from her was the equivalent of a standing ovation. The full resolution took another 9 months. I'm going to compress that here because the legal details, while satisfying to me in the way that watching something be correctly dismantled is always satisfying, are not the emotional core of this story. The short version: the civil suit settled. The quiet title motion was successful. The fraudulent deed was vacated. The mortgage taken out in my name was formally identified as fraud by the lender and by the court, and the process of removing it from my credit record was completed. Calvin was ordered to repay the rent I had paid him during the period I lived in the house, with interest. The criminal investigation resulted in charges being filed against Calvin for identity theft, forgery, and mortgage fraud, which are serious charges that carry serious potential consequences. At the time I'm writing this, that process is still pending, and because it's still pending, I'm not going to say more about it except that it is proceeding. The house is mine, not half mine, mine. The court's finding about the deed transfer and the fraudulent nature of the transaction, combined with the unjust enrichment ruling, resulted in Calvin's interest being effectively forfeited as part of the settlement. Nana Ruth's house, with its yellow cabinets and its lavender smell and its garden in the backyard that I have been learning, slowly and badly, to tend. It is mine. I changed the locks. What I want to talk about now is the family, because I know that's what people actually want to know about and because I think it's the most honest and complicated part of this. My mother did not take a side initially. I understand why. He is her firstborn and she loves him with the particular intensity that parents sometimes have for the child who arrived when they were youngest and most overwhelmed and who they poured everything into. Watching her try to hold both of us at once in the months that followed was one of the harder things I have witnessed. She came to me with her grief and I held it. She went to Calvin and I don't know what happened in those conversations because I wasn't there. What I do know is that after the criminal charges were filed, something shifted in her. She called me one evening and she said, "I keep trying to find the version of this where he didn't know what he was doing. I can't find it." I said I knew. She said she was sorry. Not for something specific. For the general weight of it. I said I knew that too. Aunt Denise has been a different kind of constant. She has never wavered and never equivocated and has been in my corner with a steadiness that I have found more sustaining than I can adequately express. She also told me in one of our conversations during the worst of the legal period that Nana Ruth had suspected Calvin of taking some money from her in her last year. Nothing she could prove, nothing large enough to feel certain about, and that she had quietly worried about leaving the house to him outright. That was why the will had been written the way it was. That was why she had left it to both of us and written that note about being fair to each other. Nana Ruth knew. Not the full extent of who he was. But she knew enough to build in a safeguard, and the safeguard was me. I've thought about that a lot. I think she deserved better from him. I think she deserved to be wrong about the safeguard being necessary. I'm glad she built it in. Calvin and I have not spoken since the day of the eviction hearing, when he passed me on the courthouse steps and I looked at him and he looked at me and neither of us said anything. I don't know what I would say if we spoke. I don't know what version of him could exist on the other side of what he did that I would want to have a conversation with. That door is not closed permanently, because I have learned that permanent closures have a way of costing you more than you budgeted for. But it is closed for now, and I am not spending energy on what might lie behind it. Here is what I know, and what I want to leave you with if you are in something similar. When someone who loves you or who you believe loves you uses that access to do something this deliberate, this planned, this sustained over time, the wound is not just the practical damage. The practical damage can be addressed. Harriet addressed it. The courts addressed it. The credit bureaus addressed it. What is harder to address and what takes longer is the recalibration of your own judgment. The question you come back to in the quiet moments. How did I not know? What was I seeing when I looked at him all those years that made me believe he was safe? I don't have a clean answer to that. What I have is the gradual understanding that being deceived by someone skilled at deception is not the same as being naive. Calvin had been practicing being Calvin his entire life. He had refined the ease and the warmth and the ill handle it to an art form, and he had deployed it on everyone who loved him for decades. I was not uniquely foolish for believing it. I was a person who trusted his brother. What I also know is this: get the monitoring. Watch the accounts. Not because everyone is Calvin, most people are not Calvin, but because love is not a substitute for documentation, and trust is not a financial strategy. Sign your own documents. Read what you're asked to sign. Call the lawyer. Keep the binder. You do not have to live in suspicion of everyone around you, but you are allowed to verify. And if you find out, as I found out on a Tuesday morning in February, that something has been done with your name and your numbers and your trust, do not call them. Do not confront them. Do not tip them off with a look or a change in your behavior. You call the attorney first, then the credit bureau, then the forensics friend if you have one. You build the case before they know you have one. You prepare the anvil, and then you let it fall. Nana Ruth's garden is doing better this year than last year. I looked up what she'd planted and started learning the names of things. There is a rose she had along the back fence that was looking rough last spring and is coming back now, which I take as a good sign. I don't know much about roses, but I'm learning. She would have liked that, I think. She was always patient with the things that needed time. So am I.